Hello, MATC scholars. My name is Robert Russell. I am an academic success coach with the CAST office at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. CAST stands for Center for Academic Success and Transition. I'm going to talk to you today about strategies for succeeding at a four-year institution and the sorts of things you should expect transitioning to a four-year institution like UNL. Again, here's my name. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm going to talk a little bit in a few slides about what it is an academic success coach does at UNL and how many other four-year institutions have roles similar to this. If anybody has any questions about anything they see here, if they'd like more information, please feel free to send me an email at robert.russell@unl.edu, and I will be more than happy to answer what questions I can, okay? To start off with, we're going to be talking about four main points today: resources and seeking help, time management, study skills, and logistics. So starting off with resources, it's important to keep in mind that resources like these I have listed here exist at UNL and other places like UNL at four-year institutions. These are resources that students' tuition money already pays for, which means in most cases, these are resources that are readily available to you the second you become a student. By not using these resources, well, it's a good idea to use these resources. You already are doing, you're already paying for these things. And in a lot of cases, we have tutoring available, free tutoring. All you have to do is sign up for it. You don't have to pay for it. In fact, our tutoring is so comprehensive. Different offices have tutoring, different departments, etc., that most students' first reaction is, how much does this cost? This is pretty great. And the answer is nothing, okay? So we have resource centers like the Math Resource Center, we have the Chem Resource Center, we have the Writing Center, we have counseling and psychological services, what we call CAPS on campus. We have actually extended it fairly recently where students at UNL can see a psychologist at CAPS unlimited amount of times. Mental health is a really, really important part of being successful, especially at a really big school, at a four-year college or university. It's a really fantastic opportunity to go get free mental health care. I really can't stress that enough. We also have the Academic Success and Intercultural Services Office, also called OASIS. We have the Career and Exploration Services. We have Education Abroad, which is studying abroad. And as I mentioned before, lots of tutoring and mentoring and consulting on campus. Now, here's the thing about help. Prior to coming to a four-year college or institution, smaller schools, typically we think of help like this. There's a net. You're in that net. Something happens, you fall through that net. There is someone right there to scoop you up. Okay, if you think about being at a smaller college where every professor knows all of their students really, really well, that is really easy to accomplish. They might be able to tell, hey, you're acting different, is something going on, how can I help, right? And if you fall through that net, there's usually someone else there to help, and someone else there to help, and someone else there to help. Smaller schools are designed this way. They're designed to scoop people up and help with retention in this way to really make these personal connections. Now, the biggest difference at a place like UNL is resources like this exist all over campus. In fact, I showed you a list of resources that exist, but you have to be the one to go utilize those resources. I talk to students very frequently in my job, and I say this, and I think it's something very much to take to heart. This is your education, right? If you need help with something, if you don't understand a topic, and if you're waiting for someone to bang on your door and say, hey, I think you need help with this, there's a really good chance that's not going to happen. Now, that doesn't mean you won't have professors that care and people in other roles throughout campus that are looking out for you. Absolutely, you will. But you have to be the one to take that first step and take ownership, right? If you don't do that, how can you possibly get ahead? College, especially transitioning to a place like UNL, which is massive, right, is all about admitting and being honest with what you don't know. Just because you might have taken a biology course before, you've never taken it at a place like UNL. It is very okay that you don't know everything. It is very okay that something is confusing to you. This is your role then, is to stand up and say, I need to seek out these resources to help me. This is a really great graphic we like to show students in the CAST office. It's called the forgetting curve, right? And what this basically shows is that immediately after class, if you see that blue line right there, that's class, right? Right after class, if you don't review at all, after a month, you start to forget just about everything you did in class when you're not reviewing it, if you're not actively studying and taking part and looking at your notes, right? The red line represents, okay, maybe you looked at your notes that you took in class very briefly, but even then it goes down. What this basically shows, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, is that you have to be really consistent with seeking help, and you have to be really honest. You know, this is nobody else's education but yours. The only person who might get hurt if you as a student aren't admitting that you know something is you, right? It's very easy to assume that everybody is in everybody's business all the time. The reality is this is your education. This is nobody else's education, and you have to speak up for yourself. A good example of this is working in groups. Students at UNL especially are really fond of working in small groups to do weekly studying and things like that for classes. I don't have a problem with that, but if you don't feel comfortable with that group of people, imagine there's 3 of you in the room and the 2 other people understand the topic really, really well, and they're moving ahead very, very quickly. If you don't know them or feel comfortable enough to say, hey, I don't understand this, and you're just playing along, sure, I get it. They might be moving ahead so fast and you can't keep up. If you don't speak up, if you don't ask for help in that situation, you're the only one that gets hurt by that, right? If you're trying to save face because you don't want to admit you don't know something, you're the only person that gets hurt in the end. And that's a really, really important part to keep in mind regarding seeking help, asking for help, and using resources on campus. We also tell students too, to get in the habit of using resources frequently. Going to a tutor once is not super effective, right? It's all about developing a relationship, developing a habit, going to get help. And in fact, typically, if you think of tutoring as something to only go do when your back's up against the wall and you're in trouble and something's due and you don't understand it, without even realizing it, you're going to start associating the tutor as some sort of easy way out. Well, they're going to help me understand this, and you're not actually going to understand how to do the work for this class. We tell students, go see the tutor every week. You have a biology class that's really hard, go see the tutor every week. Even if you think you understand what you did in class that week, go see the tutor and just verify your understanding is correct. These are the types of things primarily, like one of the biggest things, this is why this is first, that students need to adapt to at a place like UNL, as big as it is. Now, backing up just a teeny little bit, what our office does, the Center for Academic Success and Transition, or the CAST office, is we have a couple different things I'm going to talk about that we offer students. We are not part of a department at the university at all, which basically means that any student at any level, at any place, can come see us and get academic help. In addition to being an academic success coach, I'm also the person on our team that works most closely with transfer students. And I understand what it's like being a transfer student coming to a place like UNL. The coaching appointments are one-on-one appointments that students make with coaches like myself. And the idea is that we can talk about anything academically you want to talk about. If you need help with time management, which is probably the primary thing we talk with students, we can create a study plan together. If you feel like your note-taking skills aren't up to par, we can handle that together. If you feel like reading comprehension isn't there, we can handle that. Anything and everything. We have some students that make weekly appointments with us, and they just want to have us hold them accountable. I have some students who come see me and just want to complain about their professors. Totally fine. I have some students that see me once at the beginning of the semester and never again. The important thing to keep in mind is resources like our office and like academic success coaches, these things have not always existed. When I was in school a long, long time ago, none of this existed. It was very much you figure it out on your own. You could definitely go to a tutor and things like that. There was not a general academic coach. Like, let's make sure your academic life is put together. These are really, really great resources. And most four-year college institutions have offices like ours, and absolutely you should take advantage of this. Our office, just very quickly as well too, we also offer workshops, right? We offer these weekly 50-minute workshops. And I recognize as students that your eyes might glaze over when I say workshops, but we're very considerate of your time, meaning we don't want to waste it. We build these 50-minute workshops as things where you come in, you learn a skill, and you can immediately apply it to your education right when you leave. We do not like adding fluff to these. They're very much, what do you need to know to be a better student when you leave this room today? Most universities, I would argue, four-year universities and colleges are going to have things like this. And these are the types of things you need to get in the habit of doing to be successful. It's very easy to think of yourself in a silo, being isolated. I did say that it's your education, absolutely. But there's a difference between suffering in silence and actively going and recognizing what you don't know and asking for help. My first year in college, I went to a school in Michigan that was about 50,000 students. And my first year in college was really, really bad. And the biggest reason for that is I misunderstood that I thought since I was in college, I had to figure it out on my own. And I shouldn't be asking for help from things. The problem with that is you are continually in college to learn things you don't know. It is okay that you don't know something. So making coaching appointments, going to success workshops, these are all things that are going to elevate your understanding of the material and make sure you're putting your best foot forward, okay? Our office at our school at UNL offers free tutoring. We call it Study Stop Tutoring. This semester, it's on Zoom. Before this semester, it was all done in person. This is free tutoring, up to 60 minutes with a tutor, just you and them, for virtually any topic you could ever think of. I say this because, again, it's free, 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 and there are so many free tutoring opportunities on campus. All you have to do is make that first move, book an appointment, and it starts to become really, really easy, okay? Talking about number 2, time management. This is perhaps, as I say here, one of the biggest challenges that students transferring to a four-year institution face, okay? For example, how do you manage a load of more classes and more coursework? You also, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on too, but you also might be used to having a class of 10 or 15 or 20 people, or maybe 30 students is the most you've ever had in a class. At a place like UNL, it's entirely possible you're going to have a lecture of 100 students. I know for a fact that there are lectures with more than 100 students in them, even in COVID times right now on Zoom, right? How you would interact with a teacher in a class of 15 students is very, very different than in a class of 50 or 75 or 100, right? Typically, what we see with transfer students is y'all know how to do the academics. You've successfully transferred to whatever school you're transferring to, right? Where students tend to have a hard time is the social part that goes along with that. Not being used to the class size, not being used to the bigger workload, not being used to professors who you may not be able to interact with every time you want to. You might have to interact with a TA, you might have to interact with a professor only via email. You might go a whole semester and the professor never knows your name. And that is really jarring to some students. And one thing to keep in mind is that there's only a certain number of hours in the week. There's 168 hours, and there's only a number of weeks in a semester. So what we tell students pretty frequently is that students have to be very deliberate with your time. Prior to coming to a place like UNL, a very large four-year university, right? And quite frankly, any four-year institution, I think it is possible to get by without being really specific with your time. It's you know, in high school is a really good example. High school students rarely have to keep track of their time in blocks. They might have a to-do list, but often you can catch up with things and do well enough at maybe even at the last minute in a lot of cases, if we're being honest with each other, and still do well enough, right? In smaller colleges, that might also be the case. You might know your professors really well. You might have fewer number of classes that you're taking at any given time, so it's easier to manage what you're doing. But the second you start talking about 12, 14, 15, 16 credits that you might have in a semester at a place like UNL, you have to really think about your time in a very specific way. College students have a tendency to think of time in a very abstract sense. And a good example of that is this. You might wake up on a Saturday and say, I should really do some work today. And then it's 5 o'clock and you haven't done anything yet. The reason is, that phrase, I should really do some work today, doesn't mean anything. You haven't said what work you're going to do, when you're going to do it, for how long, or where you're going to do it at, okay? So when we talk about time management, we're talking about a couple different things here. This is this 4-quadrant explanation of what different times are and how we think about them, okay? So in the top left up there, we have Quadrant 1 is urgent and important. These are crises that pop up. These are pressing problems, deadline-driven projects. You might have a project that's due a week from today. This is the most important thing you have to work on. But you also might have in Quadrant 2 on the top right, not urgent, but still important. So it's prevention. It is relationship building. It is recognizing new opportunities. There might be something that your professor is recommending you do for extra credit. It might not be mandatory, but it's really, really important for you, either for your grade or for your major, or just to get to know your professor and other people well. In the bottom left corner, we have it's urgent, but it might not be important related to your academics, okay? Meetings, email, friends, and social issues that are not super, super urgent. These things still matter, right? Like, just because you go to school doesn't mean you don't have social obligations or work obligations or family obligations. And then the last quadrant on the bottom right, we have not urgent and not important. Trivial thing, unimportant emails, maybe not related to anything special, shopping online, anything that would not be urgent or important, but things that you still maybe like to spend time with. It's important to think about time in this way. All four of these categories are important, and all four of these categories happen all the time. So we want to be thinking about this stuff in a very conscious way, okay? Now, first things first, when we talk about building good time management, you have to have a planner. You do. It's the simplest thing you can do. And planners don't really mean much if you have a planner, you like the way it looks, and then you write in it for one day, and then you never touch it again. At that point, there's no point, right? What I tell students who come to see me is buy a planner and write down everything you have to do for the semester. That means when you're exhausted in week 5 or week 6, you already have every due date in your planner good to go, okay? This is a tool that's really, really important, but it's not the only tool that you should be using at a place like UNL. This is what we call a study schedule or a study plan that we coaches often build with students in our office. This represents 15 credit hours for a student. They have biology, psychology, Spanish. The MUNM class is a history of rock class, and then we have a biology lab, okay? What a study plan looks like is this represents when the student is in class. This represents class time. Nothing else is going on during this time, okay? But you also have to take in other things. Are there specific and recurring exam times that you have to block off? Are there specific homework times that you have to consider? Do you have a job? Are there clubs and organizations you have to take advantage of? Sleeping. Do you not like to do work after 10 o'clock because you're exhausted? Do you like to work out at the gym every morning before you start your day? Do you have mandatory fun time? Every Friday I see my friends or whoever, and I don't want to do work during that time. In order to be successful at UNL, this is what a study plan will look like when you have it filled out. And your first reaction might be, oh my gosh, that's a lot. And I recognize that. But the beauty of this is it represents everything you have to do in a week. It is the totality of everything you have to do, okay? This means that when you see free time on Saturday, there's nothing on Saturday here, that means there's nothing on Saturday, and you don't have to feel guilty about the work that you're not doing, okay? This also means there's time for everything and nothing gets left behind. If on Monday, for example, after biology class, this student, let's assume they did not have a study plan, they sat down and said, okay, I should probably really work on biology homework, okay? And then they sit down and 10 minutes later they go, I can't stop thinking about my psychology homework. Okay, I'm gonna work on my psychology homework instead. Now biology's gotten shortchanged, and there's a really good chance that student never comes back to biology. The benefit of having a study plan like this is everything's planned out. And if you've never done something like this before, it seems excessive and it seems like it's a lot of work, and it is a lot of work. And I think that's also really important to talk about. 4-year institutions like UNL are really, they're gonna keep you busy, and it's a lot of work. To make sure you're staying ahead of that, to make sure you're not doing things at the last minute. And also I should say what happens at the last minute, whether you realize it or not, is you start building stress and anxiety. You are behind on assignments, it'll create anxiety. You sit down and study and realize you haven't studied at all in the last 3 weeks, it creates anxiety. Those are situations where you're not gonna be doing quality work, period, full stop, right? Having a study plan like this is essential. I don't care what your major is, I don't care what you did before you got to UNL. At a place like UNL, having a study plan where everything is blocked off throughout the week and then sticking to that is super, super important. Now, the last thing I'll say about this is I tell students also, you're human and you have to be kind to yourself. This is a roadmap. It's not a Bible, meaning on Sunday, you might accidentally sleep in until 1 p.m. and you don't actually get to do the prep for your history of rock class. What this means is, instead of just having a generic block of time that says study, which might not be very helpful, you know that you have to make up 2 hours of history of rock time later on that day. It's a lot easier to hold yourself accountable this way. That brings us to our next point, study skills. And I broke this down into 3 things: studying, with quotations around it, which you'll see why in a second, reading, and note-taking. This is a phrase we hear a lot in our office: I need help with studying, okay? At the most basic level, studying is a pretty simple concept. Studying means you memorize information that you need to recall for an exam, okay? However, this gets complicated by multiple reasons. One, you're not reading the course material, okay? If every single week you're not spending time with the material, you're not gonna really know the material, okay? You're not reviewing the material every single week. As I just mentioned, college is hard. UNL is hard. You're learning a ton of different things. If you're not actively reviewing the information when you're learning it in class, you're not gonna magically wake up 2 weeks from now and understand it, okay? You're not creating study materials early before you have stress. You know the #1 reason why students hate making flashcards? They wait until the last minute and have to spend 4 hours making flashcards. That sucks. Nobody likes that. If you're making flashcards every week when you're learning new things and you spend 10 or 15 minutes on it, it revolutionizes how you're approaching the information and how you can learn this information every week. Not actually learning the course content. Back to that early idea, you're not being honest with yourself about what you know and you don't know. When all of these things happen, you can't really learn the information and you can't really memorize it. And if you're waiting until the last minute to study, you're in a really bad situation, right? Students have a tendency to think that studying means going to class and taking notes, putting those notes away. They might not understand them, putting those notes away, and then pulling all of the notes out 5 days or so before a test and relearning everything from scratch. That is not studying, that is cramming, okay? We're gonna talk a little bit more about this throughout the rest of the presentation today, but studying is a weekly process, right? Studying is a process, well, we already talked about this, but it's a good reference point again. Studying is a process that needs to happen repeatedly. When you're reviewing notes that you took in class every week, when you're asking yourself, what do I need to understand that we did in class this week? That itself is studying, okay? It's a weekly process that should be happening, right? So as you can see here, you should be reviewing it the same day you learn it in some capacity, okay? You should definitely be reviewing it before the next class, right? Classes in college, we call, at places like UNL and even any college, quite frankly, we call them typically scaffolded, meaning they build off each other. What you learn one week goes directly into what you are going to learn the next week. If you don't understand this week, you're not going to understand next week and you're going to be behind, okay? And if somebody is explaining something to you now and you're not learning it, it is an uphill battle. The best example I can think of is someone teaches you how to build a table out of wood, okay? And you can't take notes and you're just watching them, and then they tell you you cannot practice at all, and then 4 weeks from now they say, okay, remember 4 weeks ago when I tell you to build a table? Go do it. That is in essence what students often do with studying. When it's fresh in your head is when you should be asking these questions. What do I understand and what do I not understand? That brings us to our next point, reading. You have to read. And this slide is pretty basic, but the #1 thing I think that professors and staff like myself complain about is that students don't read enough. Now, reading at UNL, reading at a really big institution is going to be different in a lot of ways than smaller institutions, and definitely different than high school. High school is fascinating because you take a class, your teacher's in the front of the class with the book with you, and often you did readings together in class. The second you get to college, the reading's expected to be on your own, and for a lot of classes at UNL, there's a good chance that your professor never mentions the book by name, but it's in the syllabus, and the expectation is that you're keeping up with the reading. Now, why do you have to read? To understand class material better. If you have a class that only meets twice a week and you're not doing the reading, and your class is 1 hour each time, what you're trying to say is this super complicated subject, your only interaction with it is going to be to go to class and take notes. That is not enough time. It's not enough time. Reading helps you learn better, and it gives you a deeper recall of information. I tell students that it's a struggle, right? You should be struggling through the information and trying to understand it on your own. We build connections this way in a really, really great way. Okay? Reading triggers thinking and critical thought. How you remember content for a class should be very different than how someone else remembers content. You might have a bunch of really, really good examples that help you retain information. Someone else is going to have a bunch of different ways of thinking about stuff, okay? That can't happen if you're not giving yourself time with the book, time with the content, okay? Skipping reading assignments negatively affects your ability to participate in class. Students don't participate in class 100% of the time when they're not doing readings before they go to class. And quite frankly, it makes sense, right? If you don't understand the content, the fear is, oh gosh, don't call on me. I have no idea what's going on. The simple solution to that is keeping up with the reading. And this is in a very addictive process. When you spend time with the material in class, or excuse me, outside of class, and you go to class and you feel like you're on the same page as the professor, it is a really, really good addictive feeling, honestly, and you'll start chasing that more and more and more and more. This last point on here, find your daily max. It's also important to realize that we all read differently. It's important that you find a place that makes sense to you to read. If you're sitting in a crowded room with a bunch of people and you're rereading the same sentence 5 times in a row, I'm gonna bet that that's not a really good space for you, right? If you claim that you can read better when music's on in the background, but again, you're reading the same page over and over again, I'm going to push back and say you're probably not reading really well with music on, okay? It's also important to realize that sometimes we just have limits, right? You might say for a biology class that you can read, you know, half a chapter at most a day, or 5 pages a day before you just check out completely. That is okay, but it's important for you to know this about yourself and be honest about it, and then you can plan accordingly to make sure everything gets done in time. Last little example to represent what I was talking about studying and reading and how important this is. Now, your courses are designed in a week-by-week basis. Every curriculum is designed this way. And if we imagine that for whatever this class is, we'll say this is chemistry in this example. If X represents what you're doing in class that week, it's a very simplistic view, but your job as a student is to make sure that you understand X by the end of the week. That's it. That's it, very, very simply. Okay, what happens if you don't understand X? Well, next week when you're talking about Y in class, you're not going to fully understand it because you didn't learn about X. And that week after that, when you learn about Z, you're not going to fully understand that because you never really understood Y. And that gets repeated. And then you have a test. And that test is on those 3 weeks worth of information. And instead of just reviewing the information, you now have to relearn 3 weeks of information in, I don't know, 5 days that you've wasted, 5 days before the exam, or a week, or a day, or 2 days, right? Reading is going to help you retain information longer. Reviewing your notes, as we talked about before, as a form of studying, is going to make sure that by the time you get to the point you have a test, all you have to do is actually just review. You're not learning everything from scratch. You're just reviewing all the stuff you did on a weekly basis. Okay, note-taking. I have a 3-step method. It's pretty simple, and it honestly, I think, is a really, really effective way for you to think about your interaction with the class material. Some of this is repeating a little bit what we said before, but step 1 is you do readings before class and you take notes on those readings, and we call those pre-class notes. And again, this triggers critical thinking. You start synthesizing ideas on the text. Step 2 is that you go to class and you take notes in class, and you take notes not just what's on the board, but you take notes on what your professor is saying, okay? If your professor just has on a PowerPoint a bunch of definitions that you already have in your notes and you're still copying those down, your professor might be over here explaining some really, really important information that you're completely missing, okay? So it's really important we think about what the professor is saying first, and we write down what the most important idea is. If your professor gives you access to the PowerPoints, then you don't need to write down what's on the PowerPoints, and you can just pay attention to what your professor is saying, okay? Now, these 2 parts work together really fun, like in a really great way. If you don't do the readings before you go to class, then you go to class and you have just somebody talking at you for an hour. And that's not a super effective way to learn. You cannot listen to your professor, take notes, and learn at the same time, right? You might understand some of what's being said, but you're not learning it. And in fact, I'd be willing to bet most lectures, if you stood out of and you asked students when they came out, like, hey, were you taking notes for the past hour? Yep. Okay, can you tell me what was happening in the lecture? A lot of them would not be able to say what was happening, because writing notes and listening is going to take up the space in your brain, right? So what happens if you don't interact with the material before you go to class, if you don't do the readings before you go to class, is you haven't understood anything about the subject yet, okay? Similarly, let's say you did the readings, but you never went to class. What's going to happen then is you might have a lot of content, but you don't really understand a lot of it. Going to class, your professor is the expert. They're the ones that are going to help you really understand what it is you're doing. If you do the reading before you go to class and you don't understand X, Y, and Z, then the idea is you go to class and your professor helps you understand that better, okay? The last step is reviewing and organizing your notes. We already talked about this a little bit, but the most crucial step here is you have to spend time with your notes. If you take notes and you don't understand them on the reading, and you go to class and you take notes and don't understand them, what you're left with is a big pile of notes that you don't understand. The best thing that you can do every single week is review those while they're fresh in your head. What did we learn this week? What do I understand? And what do I still need help with? I also say during the review process that note-taking should be an active process, right? Students often think about notes as a very passive thing. I go to class and take notes and I don't look at them again. The reality is your notes are how you're understanding the material, right? Your notes should be crossed off. Oh, I wrote this on Monday, but I don't understand it anymore. Cross it off. You know, highlight important ideas. You can see an example here on the left. These notes are written really well. There's nothing wrong with them. But if you haven't looked at this in 1, 2, 3 weeks, your brain is going to scream, because it's like, where do you begin? Where do you look at? Now, what the student did is every week they went through the notes and organized them. Everything in orange is a vocab word that is definitely going to be on the test. And it's a lot easier to start looking at and relearning the material when you go back to your notes. Okay, that brings us to logistics. And you can ignore that little arrow in the middle of the slide. I forgot to delete it. We're going to talk about class size, getting to know your professors, navigating campus, and where you study and do work. Okay? So first is class size. This picture is obviously a joke. Your classes are not going to be this big, but classes at UNL are pretty big. There's some really, really big classes, okay? And as I mentioned earlier, there's a good chance that you could go throughout the semester and not really know your professor that well, or have your professor really know them. Now, there's ways around that, which we'll talk about. But the most important thing you need to do is show up. It doesn't matter that your class is big. It doesn't matter that your professor might not know who you are. You have to show up. And I think it's really important to remember for students that you're the student. You shouldn't be deciding what you want to do in a class. If your professor assigns a reading and you start getting in the habit of going, yeah, but I don't think I need to know that, right? That's not your job to say that. Your professor is telling you that in order to be successful, you have to do the reading. It's the same with class. You have to show up. If your professor is having class, you have to be there. Be proactive. This is, get to know your professor, reach out, go to office hours, get to know the TA if it's a really, really big class, get to know other people in the class and create study groups. As I have for number 3 here, find study partners you can rely on. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't go see tutors and go to other services on campus, but having people that you can meet with and hold you accountable is a really, really good learning tool. Okay, put in the work before and after class, and we've already been talking about that, but to be successful at a 4-year institution, you have to do the work. The formula that we use in our office is that for every hour that you're in class, you should be spending 2 hours outside of class on your own. So if you have a semester with 12 credits, that means you should be spending 24 hours a week on your own, okay? That is the expectation at a place like UNL. Class time itself represents very little time overall. You might have class 2 or 3 hours a week, that's it. But you're still expected to read and understand an entire chapter, okay? Last is be consistent and don't fall behind. And I will say, you might fall behind. And I will say, you're human and that happens and that's totally fine. But if you're consistent about the work, if you make a study plan, if you ask for help, if you're consistent about taking notes and reviewing them, you're gonna fall behind less, and you're also gonna find it easier to get caught up, okay? Get to know your professors. I won't spend a lot of time on this because we already talked about it, but yeah, I mean, I was kind of taking the horrible approach here that your professors will never know you. That's obviously not true. Your professors are really excited to get to know the students, even a really, really big lecture. The difference is you might have to make that first move. Go to office hours. Be consistent about office hours. At a place like UNL, a lot of research internships or job internships or other opportunities like that, someone might say to a professor, hey, do you know any students that would be a good fit for this? If you're someone that has gotten to know the professor over and over again, they might say, oh yeah, I think this student would be great for that. And they're going to think of you about this. It's a really, really good win-win opportunity. If at the end of the semester, your professor knows that you've been struggling, but you have been seeking help and you have been trying, there might even be the opportunity that they're willing to help you out, give you extra credit, do something like that because they've seen how hard you're working. If they have no idea who you are, if you have not been actively seeking help, then why would they help you? Why would they go out of their way? And I think that's a really important thing to take away from this. They want to help, but you have to go out of your way to get that help, okay? Navigating campus. This is a map of University of Nebraska-Lincoln City Campus. We have two campuses here, right? We have East Campus and City Campus. This is a really big campus. Understanding how long it takes to get from one side of the campus to the other, understanding how long it takes you to get from one building to another building. This is all really, really important stuff when you're going to a four-year institution. It might be completely different than you're used to. You might be used to going to school for an hour a day or only 2 days a week. At a place like UNL, you might now be going to school 5 days a week, and you might be on school for 6 to 8 hours a day, right? So understanding where all the resources are, understanding how to get around is going to be really, really important. And last, where do you study? This is also really important. Some people are very good about studying in crowds. They're very good about saying, hey, I'm in a cafe, but I can do really, really good work. Other people need really peace and quiet. And sometimes one person needs different things for different subjects. You know, UNL has lots of nooks and crannies. We have a library with a ton of nooks and crannies. We have cafes, we have the union, we have other buildings with seats by themselves that nobody else is around. Understanding what you need, and again, it's back to that idea of being honest. What is it you need? If you want to work in the union just because you want to be seen, but you're not doing good work, then go somewhere else. Go somewhere more quiet and try to do the work that you have to do there, okay? This is all part of that being honest. This is what I need to succeed. I want to thank you all for being here. Again, my contact information is up here. The email address for the CAST office is success@unl.edu. Our website is success.unl.edu. So pretty easy to remember both of those. If you're on campus at all at UNL, our office is Love Library South 127, but I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions about anything. If you are transferring to UNL yourself, I would definitely love to hear from you, and we could talk about what things you should be thinking about as you start your journey here. But really, no matter where it is you're going, I hope what you take away from today is give yourself time and space, be kind to yourself, you know, and just make sure you're spending enough time with everything. I don't need to know you at all to know that if you give yourself enough time and space, you can succeed. And I know this sounds really cheesy, but it's true. You can succeed and pass every single class you have. You just have to give yourself the time and the space, okay? Thank you all for watching, and good luck.